I need to tell you something before we start. I'm not a soldier. I never signed up for the Galactic Alliance Defense Corps, never went through the Hyperion Academy selection trials, never wore one of those polished cobalt blue uniforms that the recruitment posters plaster across every transit hub from here to the outer veil. I'm a cargo technician. I move freight. I calibrate load-bearing systems on commercial docking bays. I check seal integrity on atmospheric containers. I sign off on manifests that nobody reads. That's it, that's all I've ever been. My name is Oren Vaz. I'm 34 years old and I come from a place called Myra's Landing, a refueling colony on the edge of the Cauldron Belt that barely qualifies as a town, let alone a city. Most people from Myra's Landing spend their whole lives within 3-star systems. We're not the kind of people history remembers. But I was there for all of it. And I'm going to tell you exactly what happened, because someone needs to. Because the version of events that the Galactic Council put out, the official, sanitized, committee-approved version, is a lie. Not a small lie. Not an omission or a political reframing. A complete and deliberate lie, and I know that because I was standing 6 feet away from Queen Saravath of the Valdranath when the High Assembly voted to abandon her. I heard every word. So if you're watching this because you believe what the Council told you, I want to ask you to stop for just a moment. Sit with me. Because the real story is stranger and harder, and more important than anything they release to the public feeds. And it starts like most terrible things, with something that looked at first like a victory. The DOCKING station. The Selim Provisional Station was not built to be beautiful. Nobody who designed it cared about aesthetics. It was a functional structure, a hexagonal spine of interconnected modules jutting out from the asteroid body of Selim 7, patched together over 200 years of expansion and emergency repair. Half the corridors had ceilings low enough to make the Keth-class soldiers duck. The environmental systems groaned through 3 different pressure cycles a day because nobody could agree on which species comfort baseline to prioritize. The lighting in the eastern cargo bays flickered every 40 seconds on the dot, a malfunction that had been on the maintenance request list for 7 years, unfixed, because the budget allocation kept getting redirected to the diplomatic wing. The diplomatic wing, naturally, was beautiful. I knew Selim Station the way you know a place you've worked in for 6 years. I knew which corridors smelled like recycled coolant and which ones like actual breathable air. I knew that the 3rd pressurization lock on Bay 9 was slower than it should be, and you had to hold the release toggle for an extra 2 seconds or it wouldn't seal. I knew that Chief Logistics Officer Parvin Das drank his coffee at 600 and was unreachable for the 30 minutes after, and that the Keth dock supervisors took an unofficial extra break around 1400 that wasn't in any schedule but happened every single day. I knew the station. What I didn't know, until about 3 days before everything went wrong, was that Selim Station was about to become the most important location in the known galaxy. It started with the ships. I first noticed them on a Tuesday, or what passed for Tuesday on a station that technically operated on Universal Standard Time, but whose population kept 3 different cultural calendars running simultaneously. I was in Bay 6, doing a routine integrity check on a consignment of atmospheric processors bound for the colony settlements on Drev 4, when I heard the external traffic control start rerouting the incoming commercial vessels. That wasn't unusual in itself. Traffic control rerouted ships all the time, debris fields, competing docking schedules, the occasional unregistered vessel that needed to be intercepted and questioned. But the rerouting pattern was wrong. They were clearing the outer berths, all of them, not just a few priority slots, all of them, out to perimeter Ring C. I stood at the viewport for a moment, my calibration scanner hanging loose at my side, and watched the commercial freighters being redirected like water diverted around a stone. The ship that arrived 4 hours later didn't look like much from the outside. It was a cruiser-class vessel, maybe 200 meters from bow to stern, painted in the flat gray of non-reflective hull coating. No commercial livery, no Alliance registry markings. But the configuration, the specific arrangement of its drive nacelles, the redundancy array along its spine, the way its communication arrays were positioned to create overlapping coverage zones. I'd seen that configuration in a training briefing once, years ago. Valdranath Military Escort Formation. I mentioned it casually to my dock partner Hessick, a big Theron with 6 years more experience than me, and a general policy of not caring about anything that wasn't on his manifest. Hessick looked at the ship, looked at me and said, "None of our business." That should have been my answer too. It wasn't. What everyone knew about the VALDRNATH. Let me tell you what I knew about the Valdranath before any of this happened, because it matters. I knew what everyone knew, what the public information files said, what the news feeds covered, what passed as general knowledge in the kind of conversations people have in transit lounges and docking bay break rooms. The Valdranath were old, ancient even by galactic standards. Their civilization predated the formation of the current Galactic Alliance by something like 4,000 years, and before the Alliance existed, they had been the closest thing the known galaxy had to a ruling power. Not through conquest, exactly, but through the specific kind of authority that comes from being the oldest, the most technologically advanced, and the most quietly terrifying civilization in a given neighborhood. They called themselves the Valdranath. Other species called them, informally and in hushed tones, the Eternals. And the popular understanding, the one that showed up in entertainment feeds and historical dramas, and the kind of casual speculation that humans engage in when they're slightly afraid of something, was that the Valdranath were vampire-like. That word vampire, it came loaded. It carried centuries of human cultural baggage about blood and darkness and predation, and when people applied it to the Valdranath, they weren't being entirely wrong, but they weren't being entirely right either. The Valdranath did sustain themselves through a process that involved the absorption of biological energy from other living beings. That part was true, but the popular image of a fanged monster lurking in darkness, hunting unwilling victims, that was the entertainment feed version. The reality was more complicated and in some ways more unsettling. The Valdranath had an entire system. A negotiated, legally codified, medically supervised system of what they called vidi exchange, which in practice meant a rotating arrangement with consenting partners from various species who provided small amounts of biological material in exchange for extremely generous compensation packages. The process was painless. The amounts were medically trivial. The documentation was more thorough than most surgical procedures. But humans, in particular, had always had complicated feelings about it. Something in the imagery, something in the older cultural memory that the word vampire carried. It made people uncomfortable in a way that was hard to logic away. You could explain the process rationally and watch someone nod and say yes, of course, very reasonable, and then see in their eyes that something in them was still recoiling. I'm telling you this because it matters. It matters enormously. The Valdranath had been partners in the Galactic Alliance for 300 years. 300 years of treaty obligations, mutual defense agreements, shared infrastructure projects, and diplomatic cooperation. 300 years of contribution to the collective security architecture that kept the outer system stable. And then came the incident at Yarvath Station. I won't go into the full details here because it's complicated and contested, and honestly, I'm still not sure I understand all of it myself. But the short version, a Valdranath dignitary named Councillor Ethrin had been conducting an unsanctioned vidi exchange with a junior diplomatic aide who later claimed the exchange had not been fully consensual. The inquiry found procedural violations. There were hearings. There were counter-hearings. The Valdranath government presented documentation that they claimed supported their account. The Alliance investigators disputed the documentation. And somewhere in that process, in the noise and the politics and the very loud fear that the whole thing activated in various species who had always harbored reservations about the Valdranath, the damage got done. Not legal damage. Legal damage the Valdranath could have weathered. They'd been navigating complicated politics for 4,000 years. They knew how legal systems worked. What happened was cultural, emotional, the kind of damage that spreads through population sentiment the way a fire spreads through dry grass. Suddenly every news feed had opinion pieces about the Valdranath and Vidi exchange and consent and danger. Suddenly the discomfort that had always been there, quietly in the background, found a legitimate-seeming political channel to flow through. Suddenly it became acceptable to say, maybe the Valdranath shouldn't be in the Alliance. The motion came before the High Assembly, 14 months after the Yarvath incident. It wasn't a motion for expulsion. The language was careful, deliberately vague, something about reviewing foundational membership criteria in light of emerging concerns. But everyone knew what it meant. Everyone knew. And Queen Saravath of the Valdranath, their head of state, their sovereign, 412 years old, and possessed of an authority that came from being the direct descendant of the civilization that had built the first faster-than-light drive the galaxy had ever seen, came to Selam Station for the assembly. She came in person. She came without a war fleet. She came with one diplomatic cruiser and a small honor guard, because that was what you did when you wanted to demonstrate respect for a process, when you wanted to show that you were taking the concerns seriously, that you believed in the institutions. She came because she still believed it would matter. The first time I saw her on the second day after the cruiser docked. I wasn't supposed to see her. I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, or the right place, depending on how you look at it. I was running a maintenance check on the pressure regulators in Corridor 7 Alpha, which ran parallel to the diplomatic wing's secondary entrance. It wasn't a route that anyone used for anything important. It was a service corridor. Gray walls, exposed conduit, the low hum of the station's atmospheric processors behind every panel. She came through because her primary route was temporarily blocked. There was a scheduled atmospheric maintenance window that someone in protocol hadn't accounted for, and the corridor was sealed. Her security detail rerouted her through 7 Alpha without much thought because it connected to the same destination. I heard them before I saw them. The sound of footsteps with a different rhythm than anything I'd heard before, not faster or slower than a normal pace, just somehow more deliberate, more certain, like each step was placed with complete intention. And then they came around the corner. There were 2 guards first. Valdranath security. I recognized them from the briefing images, tall, extremely pale, wearing the kind of form-fitting tactical equipment that looked like it had been grown rather than manufactured. Their eyes caught the corridor lighting and reflected it back in a way that wasn't quite human, a faint luminescence that you noticed without being able to pin down exactly what was wrong about it. And then Saravath. I had seen images. Everyone in the galaxy who followed politics at all had seen images of Queen Saravath. But images, I realized immediately, were not adequate preparation. She was tall, not dramatically so, but enough that she had a natural presence in a room without needing to perform it. Her skin was the color of old ivory, not white exactly, but the white that has depth to it, that suggests something underneath. Her hair was dark, the kind of dark that seemed to absorb the corridor lighting rather than reflect it, pulled back from her face in a way that managed to look both formal and effortless. And her eyes. They were the part that the images never captured correctly. In every photograph I'd ever seen, they looked dark irises, maybe a deep gray or brown. But in person, standing 4 feet away from me in a gray service corridor while I held a pressure calibration tool and tried to remember what I was supposed to do with my hands. They were something else. They were deep red, not the aggressive, dramatic red of fiction, not glowing or fierce or threatening. Just a very deep, very old, very calm red. The red of garnets, the red of old wood polished until it almost glows. She looked at me. I don't know what I expected. Dismissal, probably. An aristocratic glance that registered my existence as approximately equivalent to the exposed conduit on the wall beside me, and then moved on. That would have been the expected response. I was maintenance staff in a service corridor, and she was the sovereign of a 4,000-year-old civilization. She looked at me and she nodded. Just that. A small, precise, genuine nod. The kind of nod that one person gives another when they share a space and both understand that they are, in this moment, equally present in it. I think I nodded back. I honestly can't remember. My brain was doing something between awe and basic operational shutdown. And then she was past me, and the corridor was quiet again, and I stood there for a moment with my calibration tool in my hand, and the feeling that something had just shifted in the world in a way I didn't have the language for yet. The assembly. The high assembly session began 4 days after the Valdranath cruiser docked. I want to be very clear. I was not supposed to be anywhere near the assembly chamber. The diplomatic wing was restricted. Access required clearance I didn't have. The session itself was closed to non-essential personnel. But Sealam Station was a place I knew. And I knew it the way I knew which pressure regulators connected to which environmental control nodes. And I knew that the auxiliary monitoring room on sublevel 4 of the diplomatic wing shared an atmospheric conduit with the main assembly chamber's secondary ventilation system. And I knew that the monitoring room had been decommissioned 3 years ago when the station upgraded its environmental management software. But nobody had ever bothered to remove the acoustic relay panels that had been installed in the walls back when the room was operational. I'm not proud of this. I want to be clear, I'm not proud of this. But I went. 2 hours before the session began, I told my shift supervisor I had a pressure anomaly to investigate in sublevel 4, which technically wasn't even a lie because there was always some kind of anomaly to investigate somewhere. And I went down to that decommissioned monitoring room, and I sat on the floor with my back against the wall and I waited. The assembly chamber above me held 37 representatives from 29 species. I could hear the ambient noise of them settling in, the particular acoustic signature of a large gathering organizing itself, the way 37 different kinds of breathing and movement and communication create a low, layered hum. And then the session began. I'm not going to transcribe the whole thing, partly because it lasted 4 hours and partly because much of it was procedural language so dense that even following it in real time required concentration I wasn't fully capable of. But I'm going to tell you about the part that mattered, the part that I have replayed in my memory, that I have sat with in the silence of my quarters, that I think about still. The arguments against the Valdranath's continued membership took about 2 hours to make. They were careful, methodical. Speaker after speaker, the Keth representative, the Theron Council delegation, the human bloc from the core systems, the Drev 4 colonial interests, rose and made their respective cases, and each case was built on the same essential architecture. We acknowledge 300 years of partnership. We acknowledge your contributions, but the Yarvath incident has revealed a fundamental incompatibility. Fundamental incompatibility. Those were the exact words. I heard them used by at least 4 different speakers. What they meant was, you are what you are, and we have decided that what you are frightens us. Queen Serevith was given 2 hours to respond. I don't know what I expected. Something diplomatic, maybe. Something measured and political and carefully constructed to give the assembly something they could use to justify a different decision. The kind of response that a political survivor would make, designed to give the maximum number of people the maximum number of exit ramps from a decision they might regret. That's not what she gave them. She stood, and even through the acoustic relay, even listening to a sound that was filtered through conduit walls and monitoring room panels, I could hear the difference in how a room sounds when someone with genuine authority rises to speak. There is an effect on the ambient acoustics, a settling. She said, and I'm going to try to give you this as close to her exact words as my memory holds them, because I've gone over this so many times that I think I have them right. I have listened to this assembly for 2 hours make arguments about what I am. You have described my people as a risk, as an incompatibility, as a problem that the discovery of a single incident has finally allowed you to officially articulate. And I want to say something to you that my diplomatic advisors told me not to say, because it is not useful and it may anger you. A pause. You were always afraid. From the first day my people joined this alliance 3 centuries ago, the fear was there. You had it then, and you have it now, and the Yarvath incident gave you a way to name it. I am not angry about the fear. Fear is a rational response to things that are different from you. I understand it. What I am asking you, what I am asking each of you individually, not as representatives, but as living beings who have worked alongside my people for 300 years, is whether this assembly in this moment is willing to be governed by that fear instead of by everything else we have built together. Another pause. Because if you vote today to remove us, you will not have removed the fear. The fear will still be there, and you will have done it alone. The chamber was quiet for a moment after she finished. And then the vote proceeded anyway. 22-15, the motion passed. And I heard through the acoustic relay, through the conduit walls, filtered and distant but absolutely, unmistakably real, I heard the specific quality of silence that fills a room after something irreversible has happened. After the vote, I came out of the decommissioned monitoring room about 30 minutes after the session ended. The station had already changed. I noticed it immediately, not in any dramatic or visible way, but in the particular social atmosphere of a place where everyone knows something has happened. People moved differently in the corridors. Conversation happened in lower registers. There was a quality of avoided eye contact that I recognized from the time a popular section supervisor had been dismissed mid-shift for reasons nobody officially explained. That same specific feeling of a community collectively processing a guilt they weren't fully ready to examine. In the cargo bays, Hessick was loading a consignment in near silence, which was unusual. Hessick hummed. Hessick always hummed, even when he was working on something difficult, even when the manifests were wrong and the cargo supervisor was unhappy. Today he wasn't humming. "You hear?" he asked without looking up. "Yeah," I said. "Inevitable," he said, which I didn't think was right, but I didn't argue. I went back to my quarters, a 4x6-meter cubicle on residential level 3, basic but private, which is more than some cargo techs get, and I sat on the edge of my bunk and tried to organize what I was feeling. Here's the thing, I want to be honest about this. Part of me, before I'd seen her, before the corridor in 7 Alpha and the nod and the eyes like garnets, had probably thought roughly what Hessick thought. Inevitable, or something close to it. I'd heard the news coverage for 14 months. I'd absorbed the ambient cultural noise. The Yarvath incident had activated something in me too, some inherited unease that I would have been embarrassed to articulate, but that was there. And then I'd seen her nod at me in a service corridor and sat in a decommissioned monitoring room for 4 hours and heard her say, "The fear will still be there, and you will have done it alone." Something had shifted in the way I understood what was happening. I lay on my bunk and stared at the ceiling and tried to figure out what I was going to do. The answer I came to, slowly, over the course of about 3 hours was probably not smart. It was probably one of the least strategically sound decisions I had made in my adult life. It was going to create professional complications and personal risks, and would almost certainly accomplish nothing of any practical consequence. But I'd seen her face, and I'd heard her voice, and I'd sat in that room while the galaxy decided to abandon someone who had, as far as I could tell, done nothing more wrong than being old and different and honest about both of those things. I decided I was going to say something. The attempt. Getting a message to Queen Serevith through official channels was, obviously, not possible. She was a foreign sovereign on a diplomatic mission. I was a cargo technician with a standard level 2 clearance card and no relationship to anyone in the diplomatic apparatus whatsoever. But Sealam Station was a place I knew. And the diplomatic wing had to eat. Meals were delivered. Atmospheric maintenance had to happen. Consumable supply runs moved through the service corridors. Cargo technicians, technically speaking, had access to some of the transit routes that the more prestigious diplomatic staff didn't bother to use. It took me most of the evening and a significant portion of what I'd been saving toward a new SEAL calibration kit, distributed among the right people in the right positions, to arrange for myself to be included in the supply delivery team scheduled for the Valdranath delegation's quarters the following morning at 800. The delivery itself was routine. Environmental consumables, nutritional supplies calibrated to the atmospheric preferences filed by the delegation, a replacement power cell for a personal device. We took it to a room on level 5 of the diplomatic wing, handed it off to a Valdranath staff member, and were turning to leave when I stopped. The Valdranath staff member was already closing the door. The other 2 people on the delivery team were already 3 steps down the corridor. I said quietly to the crack in the closing door, "I was at the assembly, I'm sorry. I wanted to say that, I'm sorry." The door stopped closing. A moment of silence. And then the staff member opened the door a little wider and looked at me, this flat, unreadable, politely suspicious look, and said something in Valdranath that I didn't speak. And then, apparently deciding that whatever they saw warranted further examination, said in standard, "Wait here." I stood in the corridor for 4 minutes that felt considerably longer, while my delivery colleagues disappeared around the corner, and the corridor hummed with Sealam Station's usual ambient processing. And then the door opened fully. Queen Serevith was standing inside. She was not in formal dress. She was wearing something simple and dark, the kind of clothing that reads as deliberately understated, chosen to be unremarkable. Without the ceremonial layers I'd seen in the corridor, she seemed different. Not smaller exactly, just closer to the scale of the space she was in. More present somehow. She looked at me the way she'd looked at me in 7 Alpha. The same attention, unhurried, like she had decided that this moment was worth the full focus it required. "You were at the assembly," she said. "It wasn't a question." "In a monitoring room below the chamber," I said, because I had decided that if I was doing this, I was doing it honestly. I shouldn't have been. I'm sorry for that too. She studied me for a moment. "What is your function on this station?" "Cargo technician. Base 6 primarily, overflow to 3 and 9. "Not diplomatic personnel?" "No." She was quiet for a moment that I couldn't read. "Why," she said finally, "not why were you in the monitoring room? Why are you here at this door now?" I thought about how to answer that. I had rehearsed several versions of this conversation in my head over the past 12 hours, and none of them had produced a satisfying answer to that question. Because the true answer was not strategic or particularly articulate. The true answer was simply, because I was there and I heard you, and I thought you deserved to have at least one person walk to your door and say the thing directly instead of feeling it from a distance. I said, because you were right, and I wanted you to know that someone on this station heard you, not a council member, not a representative, just a person who works here. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "Come in." The conversation. I stayed for 40 minutes. 40 minutes is not a long time in the ordinary measurement of things. It's enough to cross a certain distance on foot or to complete a standard atmospheric relay check in 3 connected modules, or to watch a short documentary on the history of the Cauldron Belt. It's not enough to understand a person, not even close. But 40 minutes of direct, unguarded conversation with Queen Saravith of the Valdranath was enough for me to understand something important about the situation, which was this. She was not devastated. She was not defeated in the way that the vote might have suggested. She was angry, but it was the anger of someone who had anticipated the outcome and found that anticipating it did not make it less real when it arrived. There's a specific kind of grief that looks like control because the person experiencing it is very, very old and has had a long time to practice the maintenance of composure under difficult circumstances. I recognized it, not because I'm particularly insightful, but because my mother had had the same quality in the last year of her life, and you learn to see it once you've seen it once. We talked about the station, strangely, about Selim 7 and its asteroid composition, and the way the station had grown over 2 centuries in ways that nobody fully planned. She asked me about my work, not politely, not as a social ritual, but with the specific focused interest of someone who wanted to understand how a thing actually functioned. I found myself explaining the pressure dynamics of atmospheric seal maintenance in more technical detail than I usually bother with in conversation, and she followed all of it. At one point, I said something about the 3rd pressurization lock in Bay 9, the one that took an extra 2 seconds, and she said, with what I would almost have called amusement, "How long has that been unfixed?" "About 6 years," I said. She was quiet for a moment. In my experience, the things that everyone considers too minor to fix are often the things that eventually cause the most significant problems. I thought about that for a long time after I left. Near the end of the 40 minutes, she said, "The Assembly will have issued departure protocols by now. My delegation has 48 hours before we are required to vacate." "Where will you go?" I asked. "Home," she said, "and then we will determine what home means now." She said it simply, without drama, the way someone states a fact that is large and painful and has to be sat with. I stood to go. At the door, I turned back. I don't know what I intended to say. I think I was going to say something like, "I hope things go well," or "I'm sorry for how this went." Something adequate to the moment, which meant something inadequate because no words are adequate to that kind of moment. What I actually said was, "If you need anything from Base 6 in the next 48 hours, I'll be there." She looked at me across the width of the room. "I know," she said. "Thank you, Orenvaz." I hadn't told her my name. What happened in the night? The problem started at 2:30 the following morning. I was asleep. I was deeply and completely asleep in a way that I almost never am on station, which meant that when my emergency panel lit up, the shock of it pulled me from something like 6 levels of unconsciousness all at once and left me sitting upright in my bunk, disoriented and with my heart doing something unhelpful in my chest. The panel signal was Station Emergency Protocol 4, yellow level, not full evacuation red, but the kind of alert that means something significant is happening and non-essential personnel should shelter in place unless instructed otherwise. I checked the public alert feed. It said, "Localized atmospheric irregularity in docking ring, be technical teams responding. No threat to station integrity." That's what it said. I got dressed. A localized atmospheric irregularity in docking ring B would not have triggered a Protocol 4 signal. Protocol 4 was the level you used when the situation required active management, and you wanted non-essential personnel out of the corridors without causing a panic. It was, in station security language, the calm-sounding announcement you made when something was not calm. The Valdranath cruiser was docked in docking ring B. I was in the service corridors inside 4 minutes. I want to be precise about what I saw because precision matters. I have told this story before to a journalist once and to an Alliance inquiry officer who I don't think believed me. And I have been careful every time to say exactly what I observed and to distinguish clearly between what I saw and what I inferred. What I saw: 6 vessels in non-standard formation in the vicinity of Selam Station's outer perimeter. Not Galactic Alliance registry markings. Not commercial. The configuration I recognized from emergency security training as, and this is the precise classification, hostile third-party interdiction array. That's the technical term for what it looks like when someone has positioned vessels to prevent a specific ship from leaving. They were blockading the Valdranath cruiser. The situation in the docking bay itself, when I reached the perimeter of docking ring B, was 18 figures in tactical equipment that I later learned was associated with a species coalition group operating without Alliance authorization. 3 of them already through the outer security perimeter, via an access point that should have been monitored. 1 station security officer on the ground who appeared to be unconscious but breathing, and the door to the Valdranath cruiser's boarding ramp in the process of being breached. I had a pressure calibration tool in my coat pocket and the access card to Bay 6. I have thought about this moment many times since. I have tried to understand what logic operated in my head in the approximately 4 seconds between arriving at the perimeter and doing what I did next. I cannot find a logical structure that would have produced the same decision in a person who was thinking clearly and operating with a full understanding of the risks. But I had 40 minutes of conversation and the memory of garnet-colored eyes, and I ran. The breach. I ran because I knew the station. Specifically, I knew that the service access point for the docking bay's environmental systems shared a wall with the boarding ramp corridor. And I knew that the environmental override terminal in the bay access module could, if you knew the exact sequence and had a standard level 2 clearance card, trigger a pressure differential alert in the boarding ramp corridor that would, not permanently, not for more than 90 seconds, but for 90 seconds, lock every automated door in that section in its current position. Every door in its current position. The boarding ramp door was in the process of being breached. It was open partially, maybe 60%. A 60% open automated door that suddenly locks in its current position is a 60% open door. It is not a fully breached door. I got to the environmental override terminal. I ran the sequence. I had done it twice before in maintenance simulations, and my hands remembered it even while the rest of me was operating on something that I can only describe as a kind of pure, quiet, terrified focus. The pressure alert triggered. The corridor locked. The breach team and I could see them through the monitoring screen, a grainy low-resolution feed that showed the corridor in shades of green stopped. They had the door 60% open and now it wasn't moving. One of them was communicating with something, gesturing. They would figure it out. They had the equipment. 90 seconds. I opened my communication line to Station Emergency Control. "This is Oren Vaz, Cargo Technician Bay 6 personnel," I said. "Docking Ring B, boarding ramp corridor. I have a hostile breach team attempting to board a docked diplomatic vessel. 6 external vessels in blockade formation on the outer perimeter. Station security officer down. I have bought approximately 90 seconds with an environmental lock. I need a response team here now." There was a pause on the other end that I counted. 11 seconds. "Confirm your location and clearance level." "Bay 6, standard level 2. Location is docking ring B breach access corridor. I need a response team." Another pause, 7 seconds. Acknowledged, responding units are. I stopped listening because the monitoring screen showed me that the breach team had found the manual override, and the door was moving again. I called one more channel, the Valdranath cruiser's external communication line, which was in my station directory because it had been filed as part of the standard docking registration, the same document I had signed off on when they came in. The communication connected in 2 seconds, faster than I expected. I said, "Get her to the bridge. Get the boarding ramp sealed from the inside. You have maybe 45 seconds before the exterior corridor is fully breached. I am a cargo technician from Bay 6, and I am probably not who you expected to get this call, and I need you to trust me right now." A voice on the other end, Valdranath but speaking standard, clipped and tight. "Who are you?" "Oren Vaz, she knows who I am." A pause, 4 seconds. "Understood." The standoff. The station response team arrived in the boarding ramp corridor 14 minutes after I made the emergency call. 14 minutes is not a long time in emergency response terms. It's actually within standard parameters for a Station Protocol 4 event at CLM staffing levels. But 14 minutes is a long time when you are standing in a service access corridor with a pressure calibration tool in your hand, and the monitoring screen showing you 6 people in tactical equipment in the corridor on the other side of the wall. The breach team had gotten through the partial lock. They had the door at 80% and were trying to get the remaining 20, which the Valdranath crew had managed to countersecure from inside. It was a standoff, physically. The door partially open, blocked from full breach by the interior security measure, the corridor tense with the specific atmosphere of people who have prepared for violence and are waiting for the moment to begin it. What happened next, and I want to be clear that this is what I observed, not what I was told happened afterward, is that the Valdranath cruiser's boarding ramp door did not open further. Instead, the lights in the corridor went out. Not everywhere, not the whole docking bay, just the corridor, and in the sudden darkness, illuminated only by the emergency low-level strip lighting along the floor, a figure stepped through the 80% open gap from the inside. Queen Sarevith. She was not in her formal dress. She was not in the simple dark clothing I'd seen in her quarters. She was wearing something that I couldn't fully process in the dim light, something that seemed to absorb what light there was and redistribute it in a way that made it very hard to tell exactly where she ended and the darkness began. She did not have a weapon that I could see clearly. Her hands were empty. She stepped into the corridor, and she stood between the breach team and the gap in the door, and she looked at the 6 people in tactical equipment who had come to. I still don't know the full picture of who authorized that operation and what their exact intention was, who had come to do something that I did not want to think too specifically about. She looked at them and she said nothing. And for 30 seconds, nobody moved. I don't know what she did. I have tried to explain this to several people and I cannot explain it. I know what she looked like from the monitoring screen, a figure in dim light, standing without a weapon in front of 6 armed operatives. But the monitoring screen could not convey whatever the quality of her presence was in that corridor. Whatever the specific, visceral reality of being faced with 412 years of authority and composure and old-world terrible certainty. The breach team retreated. They didn't flee. They pulled back methodically in order, covering each other, the way trained operatives pull back when a situation has changed in a way that requires reassessment. But they left. The corridor cleared in 40 seconds. When the station response team arrived, the corridor was empty. The Valdranath cruiser's boarding ramp gap sealed itself from the inside. I spent the next 6 hours in a station security interview room, which was fair. I had accessed restricted systems without authorization during a security incident, which technically constituted multiple violations of my employment terms. The interview officer was Galactic Alliance Security Corps, brought in from the main security center rather than Selim's own team. And she was professional and thorough, and clearly working from a framework that had not been designed to accommodate a cargo technician from Bay 6 as a relevant party to a diplomatic crisis. I told her everything I've told you. The monitoring room during the assembly, the visit to the delegation quarters, the environmental lock, the emergency calls, all of it. She wrote it all down and said she would need to verify the technical details and that I should not leave the station. I said I wouldn't. 6 hours after that, my communication panel lit up with a message from the Valdranath cruiser's communication address. It was brief. It said, "Your assistance is noted and will not be forgotten. The Valdranath honor their debts." And then, 2 hours before the departure window closed, the Valdranath cruiser undocked and left Selim Station. I stood at the viewport in Bay 6 and watched it go. Hessek was beside me. He'd heard enough of the story by then to have upgraded from "none of our business" to "what were you thinking?" which I appreciated, because it was a better question. I watched the cruiser's drive signature fade into the distance and tried to figure out what I felt. Not heroic. That's not the word. Heroes are people who know what they're doing and do it anyway. I didn't know what I was doing. I ran in a direction and did the one thing I had the skills to do and hoped it was enough, and then I stood in a service corridor with a calibration tool in my hand and waited to find out. What I felt was simpler than heroic. I felt like a person who had, for 40 minutes, been seen clearly by someone who had every reason to see nothing in him at all, and I had decided that was worth something. That specific moment of being recognized as fully present and equally real, across every conceivable difference of species and age and circumstance and power, was worth responding to. She had nodded at me in a service corridor. She had said come in. She had known my name. I wasn't about to let 6 armed operatives decide what happened next. What I know now. 3 years have passed since Selim Station. The formal investigation into the breach attempt produced a report that I am not at liberty to describe in detail, but which I can tell you was not as thorough as it should have been, and which resulted in no prosecutions. The Galactic Alliance's official position on the Valdranath situation was adjusted, not reversed, not repaired, but adjusted in the language of carefully worded diplomatic communications. Following a significant quiet intervention from several member civilizations, who apparently found the optics of what happened at Selim Station difficult to defend. The Valdranath are still not in the Alliance. That hasn't changed. The vote was the vote and it stands. But there have been talks, preliminary, non-binding, careful talks about what a new framework for engagement might look like. I've read about them in the public feeds. I don't know where they'll end. I still work on Selim Station. My employment situation was, after a thorough review, determined to be technically within grounds, because the systems I accessed during the incident were ones I had legitimate maintenance access to, and the use of them in the way I used them fell into a gray area that the legal department apparently decided was not worth pursuing. Hessek still doesn't hum when things are difficult. That hasn't changed. And 6 weeks ago, I received a package, physical, shipped from an address I didn't recognize through 3 routing points, arriving at the Selim Cargo Processing Center in an unmarked crate of standard atmospheric consumables. Inside was a single object, a small disc, maybe 3 centimeters across, made of a material I don't recognize. Dark, polished, warm to the touch in a way that doesn't quite make sense for an object that's been in transit. On one side, a Valdranath inscription that I had translated. It says, "The stars remember what the councils forget." There's nothing else in the package, no return information, no documentation. I keep it in my quarters, on the small shelf above my bunk where I keep the 2 or 3 things that mean something to me. Some nights I look at it for a while before I go to sleep. Some nights I think about the corridor in 7 Alpha, and the nod, and the 40 minutes that changed what I understood about the difference between fear and courage. Courage, it turns out, is not the absence of fear. It's not even the management of fear. It's something simpler and more stubborn than either of those things. It's deciding that another person's dignity matters more than your own comfort. And the galaxy, for all its size and age and accumulated wisdom, sometimes forgets that. Sometimes it takes a cargo technician from a refueling colony on the edge of the Cauldron Belt, standing in a service corridor with a pressure calibration tool in his hand, to remember it for them.